Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Davis. I'm a senior advisor at the Brunswick Group. Let me welcome you to this afternoon's seminar. Let me also thank Forum Europe for kindly hosting this event. Let me go straight on to introduce our excellent panelists. First of all, I'd like to introduce Kaiue Kuhn, who is a professor of economics at the University of East Anglia, also an academic advisor at the Brattle Group, which works in economic and financial matters. Kaiue is well known as a former chief economist of DG Comp, also as a visiting professor at Georgetown and elsewhere. Kaiue has advised on competition matters, and he's advised authorities and private firms on policy, mergers and state aid for over 25 years. Welcome, Kaiue. Let me introduce now Anna Lyle-Smith. Anna is a partner at Slaughter & May. She is both British and Finnish. She's a British solicitor and a member of the Brussels Bar. Management today included Anna in their list of 35 under 35 of high-flying business women. I assume she's not very high-flying at the moment, but hopefully we'll get back to that. And Global Competition Review named Anna as her Lawyer of the Year for under 40s. I won't make any other comments about ages. So let me now introduce Anna Mangia-Racina, who's a partner from Linklaters. Anna is a member of the Italian and Brussels bars. She has broad experience of competition law across several sectors, notably telecoms, information technology and financial services. And she has advised on a number of major investigations and mergers, both before before DG Comp and the national authorities. Finally, and thank you for waiting, let me introduce, please, Nick Levy, who is a partner at Cleary Gottlieb in Brussels and London. Nick is a British solicitor and a member of the Brussels Bar as well. Nick has got a long history of being involved in some of the most high-profile cases before the Commission in the merger field, and I've had the pleasure of working with Nick and against Nick on a number of occasions in the past when I was a lawyer. Nick is also a writer. He has written his own book, which is well known in merger control, and he is well suited for this panel because he published an article in 2019 called European Champions, Why Politics Should Stay Out of EU Merger Control. So welcome to Nick and welcome to the rest of the panel. Let me say briefly that there is a chat function whereby you're very much welcomed to ask questions of the panelists, and I will do my best as we go along to pull those together, and we'll have plenty of time at the end of our individual discussion to respond to questions. So please do feed them through, and you'll all get the opportunity to see those questions as they appear in the chat box. Before kicking off our discussion, let me just try to set the scene for today's discussion. To some, the title of the seminar may seem rather odd. That's because to many, antitrust is and always has been political. So asking whether it is now political is missing the point, you might think. Examples of governments and agencies seeking to achieve political ambitions through antitrust policies are manifold. In the EU, including a better functioning single market as an unambiguous antitrust goal is perhaps the most celebrated and long-lasting. That particular ambition, political ambition, is still very much alive and kicking, can be seen in recent fines for AB InBev, and a brand new investigation into Mondelez for parallel import restrictions. In the US, the enforcement agenda changes with new appointments, with each new administration. Former President Trump didn't invent that concept. Do you mind if I say that again? Former President Trump. Sorry, I enjoyed it too much. So why are we asking this question now? It's because there is a growing debate in EU circles as to whether politics is playing a role not only in the guiding and setting of competition policy agendas, but also in the prosecution and outcome of cases. For example, the Apple CEO famously described the Commission state aid investigation and case against Apple as political crap. Some questioned why Gazprom was not heavily fined for its alleged market partitioning practices in the EU energy markets. And in a recent merger case in the Polish energy sector, PK Oil and Lotus, some questioned whether industrial policy factors or broader political factors played a role in the outcome of the case. Now, those are just three examples in different areas of EU competition policy. So I hope that set the scene a little bit. What I'd like to do now is to set the conversation going between the panelists, and what I'd like to do is to tap into Kai Uwe's previous experience at the Commission as chief economist. So Kai Uwe, if antitrust has always been political, but things may have changed, could you explain how the political framework within which competition authorities operate has changed and become more evident?
Yeah, I think it might be quite good to take for that a slightly broader overview of how things have developed, because as you said, there's really a difference between kind of what politics thinks the role of competition policy is, which is a much more longer run decision question, and then the question of direct interference through political decisions in competition cases. And I think the first has had a pronounced change and has led to more of the latter. I think if we're thinking about kind of early competition policy in Europe, it was very German dominated, because Germany already kind of had merger and other competition policies relatively early as a national market. And it was very order liberal influenced. So it was basically the political idea that you had to set a framework in which the market should operate, and the only thing that competition policy should do is guarantee the framework and nothing else. And therefore, independence of the Bundeskartellamt was something really important. And one of the biggest worries when there was the introduction of merger control at the European level on the German side, and the biggest German resistance came actually from the worry that merger policy would be used for other things, like French industrial policy that one really didn't want to see in merger policy. And that was a major concern. Some colleagues of mine, among them Damien Nevin, my predecessor, wrote a book in the late 90s about merger and daylight, about the economics and politics of mergers, where they were analyzing the early experience and basically said, look, there was a big concern, but really nothing happened here. And indeed, when we were kind of getting through the phase of regulatory reform, that was all very process oriented. And the difficulties we got in merger policy at that time were issues of, were we actually using appropriate evidence or not? And the answer to that was, again, process, was checks and balances, trying to kind of be more careful about the evidence, and so on and so forth. And the real break that I see in terms of the perception, and that comes really from the politics side, has been the financial crisis. I think before that, a lot of policy, also the deregulatory policy of the 1990s, was very much guided by creating rules of engagement in the market. And the policy was towards that. After the financial crisis, a lot of politicians said, we see that the market doesn't really work, and therefore it's completely legitimate to say we want the following, we want this many broadband lines in certain areas of the country, and that should be directly imposed. And that did have, I think, at the time that I was there, it was kind of just that break. The institutions were still very much kind of on a focus on evidence-based policy making, on checks and balances in the institution, but publicly things had I think, already changed quite a bit in terms of the pressures that you could see. And it did come up, for example, in merger cases of attempts to influence these things. But just let me give you a couple of examples what these consequences were. For example, something we wouldn't have seen in the past is the enormous pressure on competition authorities to intervene, for example, on COVID, on price gouging in 2020, all over the world. And agencies would look at that and say, well, the prices went up, but when the supply shortages went down, the prices went down again. This might be a normal competitive response of the price mechanism. A lot of the agencies felt actually government should do something, but the expectations was that competition agencies should do something about pricing. Big difference still in 2012, when we had the big public discussions about rating agencies and that these ratings were a result of oligopoly. At that time, Almunia came out and said, we're looking at this carefully. If we ever see something, you can be sure that we're intervening. But at the moment, there's no competition problem here. Today, the agencies feel that they need to be somehow seen doing something in order to be relevant and not being replaced. And that even comes about as kind of a typical conversations I had a couple of years ago with national regulators who were asking the question, should we regulate price comparison sites, and how should we do that? And the question was, well, what do you see the problem is? And the answer from actually one very thoughtful regulator was, well, I have total sympathy for that question, but essentially we don't have time to figure that out because the pressure from politics and the public is so large that we have to be seen to act. And I think there are a lot of examples of that. If we're, for example, looking at the German Facebook case, from my perspective, it's actually terrible competition economics. There may be an issue of privacy that is concerned, but it's an example where one can kind of go through and see that probably the competition remedies that are imposed actually do nothing for the privacy issue. But the pressures of being seen as relevant as an agency, of intervening with high-tech firms, is so large, and the threats of being replaced by some other regulatory agencies is so important that actually the actions of regulatory agencies have been adapted to that. And the attempts to broaden what these agencies are doing have come directly, I think, from the political pressure.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a very interesting perspective that you take it back to the financial crisis and then other major political or for that matter commercial occurrences then having a knock-on effect into antitrust policy and enforcement. Anna, I'm sure with your practitioner's hat on, you have some observations on what Kaveh was saying.
Yeah, and I think he makes a key point, which is that when we think about the role of politics in merger control, this isn't about just a politician telling the competition agency that you should or should not do this, nor is it about just the changes in law, which you would expect will follow the kind of political spectrum. It's about the arc of policy and where it fits. And I was really interested to hear Kayova talk a lot about the word relevance, because it was really what kept coming into my mind as well when I was thinking about this topic more generally, and that importance for competition agencies to maintain their relevance, both against alternatives, as Kayova said, effectively them competing against other agencies, but also with each other. And we might talk a bit more about that later. Mm-hmm. But at the kind of pragmatic level, from the practitioner point of view, I think we've always seen the competition agencies as being political animals. I mean, they talk regularly about how they're free of political interference, they're independent decision makers, but almost in the same breath will say how important it is that their decisions are understandable and appreciated by the man on the street. Real people understand what we do. They need to maintain their importance and their relevance. We see them using the press to make those points. It was a few years ago now, but the CMA publishing its letter opposing Hutchinson 3G and telling everybody that, look, we are also on this side. This is how we see ourselves, and we're putting our views to the world. The appointments are not free from politics. At the DG Comp level, that's fairly well known, but even beyond the commissioner level. We hear every year when the appointment is being made, what the nationalities are of the people, how are we getting that balance? There's lots of these questions which are clearly political in their genesis are coming through. When we're dealing with DG Comp, everybody on this panel and many of the people in the audience will have had that experience as well, that you can't just think about comp. Yes, they've got the ultimate say on whether or not a deal gets done or not, but if you're in a sector that's got an interested DG or other DGs, you need to make sure they're involved and have got their views heard as well, because they will have a role. So it is multifaceted and something we need to think about, because politics doesn't come just in one voice.
Yeah, Anna, thank you. And your reference to the CMA and indeed to more than one voice leads me to ask you a question, and perhaps I could also ask Nick to comment on this after you, which is, obviously I hesitate to bring up Brexit, something that you and I were doing our best to make sure didn't happen, but it did. So what's your sense of what the implications of the UK exit from the EU in terms of competition policy are, and in particular merger review? Do you think that the UK exit will allow political pressure of a different kind to be brought to bear more easily?
Yeah, I mean, if I can, I'd just like to have a look back a little bit to put some of this in context, even before the Brexit referendum, because there's been, I think, a bit of a balance of power struggle between the Commission and its member states. And some of that comes through very much from Brexit, but we saw it even going back kind of to the Armenia Commission and discussions about changing thresholds and effectively the Commission expanding its remit. But the Commission has quite an unusual, almost unique role in global merger control, as having powers that it has are effectively taking powers away from somebody else. So because of its supranational one-stop shop status, the Commission can't just expand its remit without its constituents being willing to concede some of their own power. So against that backdrop of the Commission wanting to do more and eventually deciding not to, presumably because the political capital it would have cost to put through some fairly unpopular measures not seen as being worth doing so, we see a few other shifts. So we see Germany and Austria introducing new value-based thresholds in 2018. 2016, we see the CMA having to decide for itself, what is our identity going to be in a post-Brexit world? What role do we want to have on international deals? And all of that set against a really increasingly digital world, and one in which, and this comment's already come up, but that really much greater political drive that competition authorities and others need to control the tech giants. And what we saw is the UK, Germany and Austria, with their more flexible, lower thresholds, seemingly having a much bigger seat at the table, a more important role than DG Comp. And for a while, DG Comp was kind of satisfied with saying, oh, look, we can still look at these deals, look at Apple Shazam, we're able to get to see our role continuing, but doesn't at the moment feel that it's satisfied with that anymore. And here we are at the beginning of 21, waiting for the Commission's revised policy on Article 22, reversing its previous position in terms of acceptance of requests from member states that don't have jurisdiction. And I personally see that as an example of the Commission reasserting its position in terms of balance of power. I think we see another interesting feature on that we might come on to later with the Digital Markets Act, which has its own interesting questions about the balance of power within the Commission, because who's going to be the guardian of that piece of legislation. So to the question of Brexit, I think anyone who's been watching the CMA for the last 3 years or so, and of course we are now only just over 5 weeks out in real Brexit, but in the last 3 years or so, we've seen the CMA have taken a very clear policy position that it does not want to be an also-ran in the merger hierarchy globally. It wants to have a leading role on cases. And I think there will be a lot of people, perhaps particularly US companies, who would see the CMA as the most aggressive regulator on merger policy globally at the moment. It's taken a really expansive approach to its jurisdictional thresholds. It's taken a really tough line on remedies, and it's even encouraged US authorities to reopen deals that they'd previously cleared. And when you see the rhetoric of Brexit, which is all about, are we better off in or out of the club? there's going to be, I think, a real political tension of the CMA clearly wanting to show that it's able to assert its views, it's able to assert its power on deals. But the Commission, of course, will not want to see itself losing out to the young pretender, and particularly will want to be avoiding any headlines of CMA could protect UK consumer and EC couldn't move fast enough or couldn't achieve the same outcomes. But I think for me, the balance of power is not just going to be between DG Comp and the CMA. I think we'll also continue to see that kind of within the borders of the EU. In terms of political interference, I kind of bring this back to that arc that we've already spoken about, because I don't think anyone is suggesting that there was a British guardian at the gates preventing politicians from influencing transactions before. But what we did see immediately after the Brexit referendum result was the then president of France, François Hollande, saying that this was an opportunity for the European project to reframe merger control in favour of national champions. Now, we haven't seen that yet, but what we have seen, and particularly in the intervening years, a number of requests for a reform from Germany, France, sometimes also with Poland, sometimes also with Italy. We are seeing little bits and pieces of a shift with a broader political influence in terms of the industrial policy, but I'm not sure we necessarily have a complete change as a result of Brexit of the idea that politicians can directly interfere in outcomes.
Anna, thank you. And we'll come on to a debate about where we are with the European champion idea a bit later. Nick, could you just briefly comment on what Anna's had to say? Any interesting observations regarding Brexit?
So sure. Thanks, John. Thanks, Anna. I agree considerably with what Anna said, particularly about the implications of Brexit for enforcement of merger control by the CMA. And there we can see, as Anna explained, a far more muscular interventionist approach in anticipation of Brexit, which 6 weeks on continues to manifest itself, both with respect to jurisdictional scope and taking jurisdiction over transactions and the substantive appraisal of transactions. So that's already clear. The question I think John also framed is what effect can we anticipate for European Commission merger enforcement as a result of Brexit? And there I think it may take time to see what the effect will be. The first thing to say, I think, is that Britain and British officials have historically played an important role in the evolution, application, and independence of European competition policy. Leon Britton, a British commissioner, was at the helm when the merger regulation came into being. Jonathan Fall was the architect of the modernization program in the early 2000s. Philip Lowe was Director General at the time of the reforms in the mid-2000s that led to the new substantive test and the checks and balances being introduced. So Britain's played a very important role within the Commission. And British officials, British government successively over that period have been fairly staunch defenders of an independent commission, independent antitrust enforcement, even though UK merger control only really relaxed the political oversight in the early 2000s. I think, as Anna said, a number of things may limit, at least in the short term, the implications of the UK's withdrawal from the EU. The first is that over time, British politicians, both left and right, have become a little more sympathetic to political intervention, as we're seeing with the fairly cross-party support for the national security measures that we're going to talk about in a minute. Secondly, I think you see that other member states have been ready to take on Britain's role as being a defender of an independent antitrust policy. And thirdly, you can see that even certain of those jurisdictions whose governments are talking about injecting political oversight, the antitrust agencies are often speaking very differently and talking about defending the independence of enforcement. So for the time being, I don't think we're going to see significant change in EU enforcement as a result of Brexit. And one critical reason, I think, is Commissioner Vestager. She's committed to maintaining, protecting the Commission's independence. She's resisted political pressure in a number of high-profile cases, Siemens Alstom, I guess, being the most prominent. She's rebuffed the calls for political oversight by the Council and the reopening of the text of the merger regulation. And of course, she's associated herself, I think, largely with the countervailing view of enforcement policy over the past 20 years, namely that if anything, it's been too permissive and should be toughened. But what comes after her, we'll have to see.
Yeah, and we will. I think we'll be all be watching very closely to see a number of cases that are currently going to have review by both the Commission and the UK. And interesting to see how those outcomes match. Anna Maria, let me come to you now. Thank you for being patient. I see you've got to the office today. That's good of you. I haven't left this little room for, it seems like, many months. But I'd like to come back to the continent now, and in particular to ask you a question, not so much on the issue of antitrust as a tool for merger control, but the growing array of tools that EU member states and indeed other countries are using in terms of controlling particular foreign direct investment. But I'd like you to focus particularly on whether or not we might see more from countries such as France and Germany, who have a power to overturn potential merger prohibitions by their national authorities, whether we might see more of that, because we've seen a couple of examples of it in the last couple of years, as governments look to try and find ways to achieve broader economic objectives.
Thanks, John. So probably if I give a short answer to your question, I would say maybe, but not certainly. I just want to go a bit back in terms of just also to connect to what Anna and Nick were saying in terms of a bit of the history, where we got to, also in terms of this growth of FDI regime and the role they play vis-a-vis, merger control traditional assessment. So as already was mentioned, we got the Siemens Alstom Commission blocks the merger. We have a Franco-German manifesto. We go on. This is 2019, 2020. Commission really stands its role and keeps on saying, competition law and merger control is not the right way to protect economic sovereignty. You should look at something else, and you should look in particular at trade defense mechanism. That's the way you should go forward. They published last year first a European policy manifesto where they really clearly say, and Commissioner Vestager was giving speech around the globe saying, you should really, member states, please look after your vulnerable businesses and intervene if you want in order to protect security and public order. But don't ask me to do it through merger control rules. There are other avenues you can choose. And then in June last year, we saw the foreign subsidies paper, which in itself was I think a bit of a revolution from EU perspective. It's about how can we monitor investment into European businesses and what's the role the Commission would play. So if I have to be honest, if I were a member state like France or Germany that indeed do have this power to overrule the decision of the NCAs, and these powers have been used, but if we look, for instance, at Germany, they've been used rarely. I mean, they get the FT, first page, but they also create quite a lot of public resentment, of how the independence of the national competition authority is respected. If I were a member state right now, I would honestly use the more, allow me to say, opaque and rule on FDI in order to get some objectives that probably, you couldn't get, or at least you would get more blatantly by just simply overruling your NCA. And we know FDI rules have grown exponentially. I think COVID and the pandemic has just given it a boost. I mean, just kind of everyone acknowledge, I need to be independent. I need to be, and be able to supply myself, manufacture everything I need. And this is why we see the scope of national legislation across Europe on the FDI front changing honestly every other week. We now have, I think, around 16 member states having FDI regime, 17 if I add, the UK project, the NSI bill, which is going to come soon. So what would I do? I would definitely use that instrument in order to achieve what is clearly a much more political policy objective. I mean, if there's something which is political, that's FDI. The rules are opaque, as I said. The scope of intervention is actually quite left at the discretion of the state, and we see more and more commitments being the ordinary course of this review. You are not engaged as a business fully transparently as you would be vis-a-vis a merger authority. And also merger rules need to be in order to be credible, need to be you need to have legal certainty. So somehow that's not really the same when we see FDI regime. So, I mean, just to go back to your original question, John, I think we would not see much more than that type of intervention. I would expect much more opaque FDI reviews and decisions, which we will never know really what was behind, but we will just know they've been used in order to achieve policy objectives that are far beyond what merger control rules allow.
Yeah, that's a very interesting perspective, Anna-Maria. It's right that the public interest is in the eye of the government at the time, or for that matter, the relevant minister at the time, and that changes. It's certainly the case that we all have to think much harder about FDI rules than ever before. I think we have 15 member states or thereabouts now having rules under following the screening regulation. 6 more are coming, and then of course there's the UK with its quite extensive proposals. Just something that I've been working on has a range of antitrust approvals around the world, but it also has 5 FDI approvals needed in Europe. And I can say, quite honestly, that is an unusual experience, but it's one that I think we're all going to have to become more familiar with. So with that, let me now, if I may, go back to Kai-Uwe. So where are we now, Kai-Uwe, on the idea of promoting European champions, do you think? Obviously, the idea is proposed and pushed again by France in particular and by Germany. Looks as though they've had a bit of opposition from the smaller member states and more recently from the Portuguese presidency. One proposal, Fincantieri Chantier Atlantique, has recently collapsed, saving, no doubt, Commissioner Vestager from the difficult question of deciding whether or not that should be approved. And then you have the Veolia hostile bid for Suez, where it seems that the French government can't make its mind up about whether it wants one champion or 2. So what do you think? Where do you think we are, and how do you think the Commission will respond to the next time a proposal comes forward to create a European champion, but clearly creates, at least on the historical approach, competitive issues?
Well, I think kind of in substance, we're not going to see a very large change in that area, despite of the pushes from the German and the Italian side. So what I'm expecting is more that we're going to see things like in Fincantieri, where if the Commission really would like to prohibit, they're going to use their influence for the firms to drop out and for the deal to collapse. And the reason for that is really that merger analysis is actually, in a sense, much simpler than antitrust and state aid, in the sense that there is a much more of a clear scheme of what you need and want to test, and where that really puts restrictions in how you can actually come to these arguments and actually submits them to a fairly rigorous test. And in most of these mergers, these have failed. And also the attempts to actually have an influence on this have failed quite spectacularly for quite a while. I mean, the one case that I was involved in which kind of some of that public pressure was there was Outokumpu in Neos, in stainless steel, where there was a European Roundtable of Industrialists heavily criticized the intervention there, basically by saying you just get market definition wrong. You don't know how what you're talking about is commission and market definition. It's very, very narrow, and you're not taking account of China. And the problem in that case with those arguments were that they were just simply not right. I mean, competition through imports in China were completely taken account of in the analysis. Actually took a lot of time also that analysis was done. And there was a fundamental misunderstanding of what market definition does in modern merger analysis, that things don't stop at market definition, that outside of market influences are taken into account. And even within markets, sometimes you look at narrower things. So it's a much more flexible thing that requires further analysis. And I think that's mostly not understood. And you very often got in these cases, basically the issue that there's some commissioners who are critical, who like to talk about national or European champions. The analysis goes to the prep meeting for the commissioners meeting. The objections are brought up, and then just Comp has so much of an informational advantage in having analyzed these things that they shoot down everybody. And so these people sit there and don't have a factual based argument anymore. And so that really undermines any political pressure in the college decision in the end. And so I think, but that's because the facts that you need to look at are relatively limited, and the theory of how you get to harm is much simpler than, for example, in antitrust. And there it's even more simple than in state aid. And so when I was, for example, looking at Siemens Alstom, I have to say, I saw that they were notifying this and was going, how can they think they can get this through? Because it was obvious that there was a high-speed issue there. I mean, without having been involved in this, right? They're the two biggest high-speed train producers. This is particularly important for the European markets. And there was no efficiencies in sight, and you later hear that the efficiencies weren't even claimed in that kind of context, right? So where do you even go with those arguments, given kind of the merger analysis? I think, and I think this was something that was mentioned before as well, the political influence and the political changes come much more in the opposite direction, which come out of these analyses that say we have much more concentration, even at the aggregate level, higher margins in industries. This has led to the distributional issues that we're seeing in economies. And that's the claim, and I think that's much more controversial, but it's a claim that a lot of people believe this is an outcome of lax merger policy. And that belief is actually shifting how we're looking at mergers. I think that's a reason why overall we're seeing a much tougher approach to merger policy, and also a push towards a reversal of burden of proof in that area, to actually make it easier to intervene and not harder to intervene. And I think that's much more where we're going. And I think these European champion cases are going to be rare and rarely successful.
Thanks, Kai. You make a really interesting point about the kind of inequality of arms, the decision-making time. And I've noticed that the debate, the proponents of, if like a loosening of competition rules in order to create champions, have started to understand a little bit more that they have to do more than say it. So some of the papers that were produced, you might have a fairly jaundiced view of them, and yeah, I do. But nevertheless, I think they're starting to understand they have to do more than just say, we want this to happen. And there may well be cases where, going forward, where advocates, the advisors, including some people on this seminar, may find themselves, needing to support the political proposition with harder evidence of competition or potential competition from China, as an example. Nick, you've done a lot of merger cases in your life. What's your perspective of where we are now in this debate?
So thanks, John. Political pressure on the European Commission in merger control is not new. You and I will well remember the Aerospatiale de Havilland case, first transaction to be blocked in the early 90s. There was a lot of speculation at the time that pressure to get that transaction approved would prevail, but the Commission withstood that criticism and really hasn't looked back since. Volvo Scania, a decade or so later, again, the Commission withstood political pressure to approve a transaction that some said would have created a regional champion. Deutsche Börse, NYSE Euronext, another transaction that Kai Uwe and I will recall well, which was trumpeted by some as creating a European derivatives exchange champion. The Commission too has resisted pressure to stand in the way of transactions that there was political pressure to block or to make difficult. The ArcelorMittal transaction, the E.ON Endesa transaction, the General Electric Alstom transaction. These were all transactions where at least at some political level there was pressure on the Commission to block those deals, but they were approved. What's perhaps new, I think, is a number of things, and I'll single out 3 or 4 of them. Firstly, I think the fear of China, and secondly, the related concern about the consequences of globalization, and the fears about strategic national champions falling into foreign hands. And the second broad set of considerations, I think, is a pressure not just to make antitrust enforcement relevant, which I agree with, but also pressure to use a process that is viewed as working well, that is established, that has a framework, to pursue other goals, whether they be political, industrial, employment, social, environmental. They all may be very good goals, but they're different ones from the ones that antitrust enforcement has historically been designed to pursue. So as to your question, I don't think we're going to see the EU changing radically the existing architecture and adopting the Franco-German manifesto, which, as people will recall, proposed that the Council essentially have a veto over Commission prohibition decisions so that they could overturn those. I think there are many reasons why that proposal would be a bad idea. I'll mention half a dozen of them. Firstly, it would lead to the approval of transactions that the Commission, after a year-long investigation, would have determined would have led to higher prices or reduced output or less innovation, so harming European consumers. Secondly, while there may be cases, and maybe Siemens Alstom is a good example, where there could be agreement as to what a European champion might look like, there'll be other cases where one country's national champion may be very bad for another country's players in a particular industry or another country's customers in a particular industry, and trying to balance those considerations in thinking about champions is not easy. Thirdly, I think that introducing a political approval process would inevitably undermine the value of EC precedent. It would create uncertainty. It would really cause many to question what is widely viewed, as I say, as one of the most successful achievements of the Commission, at least in the antitrust sphere over the last 20, 30 years. I think it would also lead to poor decision-making and short-termism. Politicians, by their nature, are inclined to look at the short term at the expense of longer-term considerations. Yet long-term competitive markets are generally acknowledged to be the most effective drivers of consumer growth and consumer welfare. And so you might end up with very poor decision-making as a result. A further consequence, I think, is that it would paradoxically deter companies from offering remedies to cure competition concerns. So you could have an even worse outcome than would be the case under the existing regime, because competition concerns wouldn't get addressed. There's also clearly a risk that if the EC were to move in that direction, then other countries would follow suit. and you'd have an awful situation where every country trying to advance its own national champion. And finally, I guess an inadvertent consequence of this approach would be, once you give the Council power to overturn Commission prohibition decisions, the next step is to get them to overturn Commission approval decisions that they don't like for whatever reason. And I think down that road lies chaos. But ultimately, as others have said, politics matter. The EU is politically appointed, the European Commission is politically appointed, and it's composed of former politicians largely. The Commission can shape policy in a way that affects outcomes with respect to market definition, for example, or the treatment of efficiencies. And it has discretion in a number of important areas where judicial review may be less exacting, for example, the scope of remedies, which can have an important impact on transaction feasibility and so forth. So in the midterm, I think we could begin to see, for a whole variety of reasons, whether it's Brexit, whether it's the geopolitical situation, whether it's just the cycle of history, changing in the direction that I guess your question implies, a greater tolerance towards national champions. But at the moment, if there's a tension between that direction and the other direction of travel, which is towards more intervention, greater scrutiny, less permissive, it's that direction at the moment which is in the ascendant.
Thank you, Nick and Kaiwe. So I think it's 2-0 to the antitrusters, at least the traditional antitrusters. Maybe we're only at half time though. I'd like to explore actually now the difference between, is there an area that may play a role here? Politics may play a role between clearance and prohibition. Let me come to Anna and then Anna Maria, who I think has got some experience, in the area of whether is it binary, is the decision binary as to prohibit or clearance, or is there a solution that where politics can play a role?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two particular areas where politics plays a role outside the pure question of clearance or prohibition. The first is one I touched on earlier, which is this notion of referral. In other words, who's actually going to be making the decision? This is a peculiarly EU phenomenon, but I think it's going to be growing in prominence in the coming years. And it's one where I think we're not going to be able to look just at the individual transaction. You need to look behind at the policy and politics to understand whether a transaction might get referred. I've already touched a bit on the Article 22 policy shift, but I think an important point of that is that we understand the Commission is not just sitting back and waiting to see if member states want to exercise their Article 22 request rights, but rather the Commission is also encouraging member states to do so. So there are push and pull factors on that. Similarly, Article 9 references are not just a question of the Commission looking at the transaction once a request comes in. These are also things where both sides will have a view. So you need to look at those things very much in the round. And indeed, we hear of member states refusing to make Article 22 requests up to the Commission because they see it as a quid pro quo of the Commission refusing their earlier Article 9 requests. So there's definitely some politics at play in the referral mechanisms in Europe. I think the other area is on remedies. And for years, the orthodoxy has been that vertical mergers are pro-competitive, they eliminate double marginalisation, but we've seen a change in that with DG Comp. I mean, even this week, divestment remedies apparently being offered in the ongoing EssilorLuxottica Brand Vision deal. But more interesting still for me is the growing use of behavioural remedies, which have been effectively ruled out for many years because the view was, look, these are the authorities being asked to be regulators. That's not what we do. We're competition agencies. We don't want to have this role. It's also unduly burdensome for us to continue our monitoring. And I think when we're seeing this growing use of behavioural remedies, it highlights a few key themes. The first is that I see it as a nod to those Franco-German Polish requests for reform. And I say a nod because I think for the reasons that Nick outlined, I don't think we're going to see the proposals adopted wholesale, but they did suggest that behavioural remedies should be more widely used in all sectors. So I think seeing the Commission using them is a good example of the Commission showing itself to be flexible and not the sort of rigid and out of touch authority that some of those proposals tried to paint it as. I think it's also an example of the Commission sending a message to businesses, to its member states, and indeed to its merger control counterparties throughout the world, that vertical mergers are not necessarily pro-competitive and that it will extract remedies where they're needed. And I think that's a particularly important message in the digital world that we live in, where I think we can expect more and more foreclosure concerns to be at the heart of competition reviews of digital transactions than the more classical horizontal effects of times past. I think the final point on this behavioural remedies shift, which I find interesting, is that there's the greater willingness it implies on behalf of the agencies to be in a reviewing and maybe quasi-regulatory function. And of course, it's set against an environment where we are seeing a greater push for ex-ante regulatory type enforcement, particularly in the digital space, but elsewhere too. And so I think we do see the authorities changing their view on that burden and whether it's worth it. And I think what's particularly interesting here is that until very recently, the agencies that we associated with a greater willingness to accept behavioural remedies would have been China and Russia. And they are, of course, more organised economies. So as we come to this push for more industrial policy, I wonder whether that's an echo from there. A very final point is that, of course, on this behavioural remedies point, we are at the moment seeing the Commission facing censure from the EU Parliament for apparently having been too lenient on the Google Fitbit case, and meanwhile also having comments from the CMA that it would not have accepted the same remedies had it been in a parallel review. So a politically tense decision for the Commission to justify, no doubt, in the coming weeks and months.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think one of the challenges for the agencies and for those advising them for those advising on these matters is trying to get a sense of predictability in terms of the outcome. Remedies, particularly in vertical cases, can frankly, in a sense, it's easy to identify and describe the problem. It's very hard sometimes to decide whether you need a remedy to resolve it and how far that remedy should go. So I thought it was fascinating that you've got the CMA effectively publicly criticising the Commission, and when you have a world where more and more cases are going to find themselves having to negotiate remedies both with the EU and the CMA, then trying to find an outcome that is satisfactory for both is going to be a challenge. So, Anna-Maria, would you like to comment on this interesting area?
Yeah, thanks, John. And so I fully agree with Anna, and I would just add 2 points and then wanted just to run through a recent case that probably, raised a couple of questions on this. So, I mean, as Anna said, these behavioral commitments at times is a bit of a nod to the French, German, and Polish politics. I would also add it's also a bit of a nod to listen to other DGs within the Commission. I mean, if we look at some of the most recent telecommunication case, I mean, we know from experience that DG Connect has pushed heavily in order for transaction to go through with what I would call more lenient remedy package than what a pure horizontal case would have requested, and that was it because of favoring 5G rollout or any other policies that the Commission has beyond what DG Comp is looking at. And the other point is that, of course, I think it's you interestingly see you said vertical cases difficult. I see sometimes some of these cases are horizontally effectively is horizontal overlaps, and the remedies are transferred in somehow a vertical access remedy. And I think the case that we just wanted kind of to reflect on is a bit of an outlier, which is the Pekin Orlen Lotus decision of last year. So this is not a Siemens Alstom. You don't have two member states beyond, and supporting the merger. It's not even a policy objective. It's in the energy space. It's full in Poland. This is very much a member state, Poland, pushing to create a regional energy champion. And, I think the question that are raised when you look at the remedy package and what we read in the news, in terms of senior competition official were, about to block the deal, and then, commissioner asking them, please find a way to have creative remedies in order to solve the issues. You ask yourself, where does this case fit? And I think that's where you realize what is the role of politics and what else is there. We know the case came in the middle of pandemic. We know that Poland has pushed strongly to not only to create a regional energy champion, but also to become more independent from supply from Gazprom and others, outside Europe. It wasn't really discussion. We're in the middle of the recovery budget negotiation at EU level, so quite sensitive matters. And Poland was going through a first round of election. So I think it's what I wanted to leave, John, this way. It's really, you see the remedy package was in itself probably what you wouldn't expect in a merger to monopoly. It was kind of an easier way out than a normal case. There are also a number of behavior commitments, and recent press release from companies says that actually they're not really thinking about divesting what the Commission asked them to divest. They're thinking about creating a long-term relationship with whomever is going to come into the Polish market. How that fits with a structural remedy, it's a question mark. But I think it raised the observation as what happens when politics come in, and merger cases like this one might be exceptional, but if they don't sit in a vacuum, there are other things going around which might influence the outcome. And as Anna said, remedies sometimes might be the way out instead of a prohibition.
Yeah, and I think one observation I'd have is that it's very difficult for the people on the outside who don't know the detail as to whether or not the remedy, particularly a behavioural remedy, is good enough, and therefore it's quite hard for that to be criticised compared with a prohibition or a clearance. So I think it's an area that allows for let me just put it this way: a blending of different interests, and it does depend on whether we will, going forward, whether we're going to see the Commission maintaining the line that Nick and Kayode have described, or being more flexible. So I'm going to ask our audience, if I may, to keep sending questions. We're going to have one last question for the panel. And if I could ask the two speakers, that's going to be Nick and Kayode, to be brief, please, because we're a little short of time. And I didn't think we could do this without asking a question about digital markets. So I wanted to ask you whether you see in recent developments, particularly in the EU, but not exclusively, whether there's a desire just to enforce generally accepted antitrust principles in unfamiliar, fast-shifting markets, or something else. In other words, is politics playing big tech, getting at big tech?
So, John, great question. There's so much to be said on big tech. I'll try to be brief, as you've said. As I said earlier, politics do matter in antitrust enforcement and in other areas of government activity. The political context can shape enforcement priorities, and it seems to me there's nothing wrong with that. A former CEO of the UK CMA said competition agencies are part of a broader public dialogue on the issues that societies want us to address and resolve, and we cannot duck our responsibility to engage in that dialogue by retreating to the proverbial ivory tower. I don't think the political pressure determined the outcomes of recent investigations by the Commission into the digital platforms, even if politicians, at least some, may have been cheering from the sidelines. I have 6 observations on this. Firstly, the EC has a long history of taking on big tech, dating back to the 1980s with IBM and early 2000s with Microsoft. Secondly, the EC hasn't focused only on the digital platforms, also cases against Intel and Qualcomm and Broadcom. Thirdly, I think it would be wrong to see the EC as the only agency that's looking at the digital platforms. There are other agencies around the world, as we know, that are too. Fourthly, there's been some political criticism of the EC's record with respect to the digital platforms, including in particular criticisms of the approval of all transactions involving the major digital platforms over the last 15 years. Fourth, as in merger control, the EC is largely insulated from political interference, constrained by the law, and must act fairly. So while there may have been shortcomings in some of the findings reached by the decision, and I speak in a personal capacity, although our firm does a lot of work for Google in this area, the EC's assessments were grounded on at least what the EC believed to be established principles of antitrust law and economics. What's clear, though, is that politicians have in recent years closely followed the cases brought by the EC against the platforms. We've seen, and people have referred to, the European Parliament's criticism of the Google Fitbit case. They also criticized Commissioner Almunia's attempt to resolve the Google shopping case. And more fundamentally, politicians have become persuaded of the need to complement antitrust enforcement with regulation. And the perceived need for regulation reflects, I think, 5 considerations, or certainly 5. Firstly, an appreciation that merger control, while being flexible, there's a limit to what it can do, not only because of the legal framework in which it operates, but also because the focus is inevitably on a single and fact-specific transaction. Secondly, there's a recognition, there's been criticism indeed, that antitrust cases take time and necessarily focus on the unilateral conduct of a single company. Thirdly, there's an understanding, an increasing understanding, I think, that many of the concerns expressed about big tech, right or wrong, cannot readily or easily or reasonably be addressed by antitrust enforcement. Fourthly, a related point, there's an understanding that at root, many of these concerns are not due to a failure of the competitive process and therefore shouldn't be left to antitrust agencies. And finally, I think, and this is the flip side of the point, there is an appreciation that broadening antitrust enforcement to cover broad business conduct that has no significant anti-competitive effects would increase uncertainty, the vagueness of the law, and discourage conduct that promoted efficiencies. So what do we have? We have an array of regulation, some proposed by the Commission, some proposed by national authorities, some consistent, some not. And these effectively represent an attempt to control big tech or to regulate big tech through a regulatory or political process rather than a legal one. They envisage processes that entail, I think, inevitably, and are designed to give much greater discretion for the agencies in question than those agencies or other agencies have when they apply antitrust rules. And so the regulators of the digital platforms and the other digital players that are caught by these rules are going to come, I think, under political pressure to exercise their discretion in a way that is less easy to exercise in the antitrust sphere. And unlike antitrust cases, agencies may be less easy or may find it less easy to resist that political pressure. So while the effect of regulation, I think, is hard to predict, including because the details of the various regimes are not yet determined, I do think it's quite possible that we may see greater political involvement in the regulation of digital platforms, not necessarily through the antitrust route, although some agencies like the CMA and the FCO have flagged a determination to apply the antitrust rules assiduously to digital platforms, but to sidestep the antitrust processes and use regulation to achieve a broader range of objectives.
Thanks, Nick. Conscious of time, what I'm going to do, I've got 2 questions, and if I may, I'm going to set up the second question for Anna Maria and Anna to think about while I come back to Kai-Uwe on digital. And so the question that I've got is, what is the actual influence, or what will be the actual influence of the Green Deal agenda and environmental politics on the Commission and the Commission's approach to merger review? That's a good question, which blends politics with merger control. And Kai-Uwe, if I could ask you to answer this question again from the audience as you respond. It's a bit unfair of me, I know, but it's a German question. I hope you tolerate me raising it. Comes from Ben Brabender, Commentum Political Communication. Following on Kai-Uwe's introductory remarks, in a recent roundtable debate, Andreas Mundt, president of the Bundeskartellamt, mentioned that in light of the dominant position of big tech, e.g. search, advertising, social media, a much closer cooperation of the Bundeskartellamt with authorities in the areas of data and consumer protection, cybersecurity, and even financial market supervisors will mark the new normal going forward. What is your view, Kai-Uwe, on such an amalgamation of competencies? So, could I invite you to respond to that, if you don't mind, as it were, on the hoof?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I'm a bit. So I can see the advantages in a sense that one looks at multiple issues at the same time. But I think where we have the disadvantage at the moment, and where I'd rather see a separation of those types of powers, is that these issues tend to be very different. I think they have to be analyzed in different ways, and the remedies to them tend to be very different. And the problem is when you get an amalgamation, like in a competition authority, the mindset is one of competition regulators, and they think about these things very differently. So I talked about the Facebook remedies, and for example, in Facebook, I don't think we can substitute by privacy rules, for example, because I have no idea whether one rule is better or the other, and what the relative differences is. So when prices change, that has no impact on me, on my substitution behavior. And so the remedy is one of giving choices to customers. Well, that doesn't solve the privacy issue. And so it's pushing things into a framework of thinking that is not appropriate for the privacy issue, that's actually going to give us both bad competition policy and bad privacy enforcement. And so I think it's really necessary to separate these issues to different regulators who think about them, so that on the privacy side, for example, there's much harder thinking about what appropriate interventions actually are. A lot of the interventions that we also have on the data and privacy side are relatively complex, hard to process for people. Those issues are not traditional issues for competition regulators. And I'm actually at this point, I rather think it's a really bad idea to amalgamate, because the analysis, the remedies are not properly separated in a way that we're getting them appropriately adjusted to the problem in question.
Yeah, I share your view strongly. Well, we've got about 4 minutes left. So, Anna Maria, could I ask you to perhaps kick off on that question about the Green Deal, and then invite Anna to follow up?
Sure. So the short answer to the question, the role is we haven't seen it yet. So we had a full day conference last week from the Commission about, the Green Deal, the contribution that everyone has been given. Approximately 200 people have responded to their call for consultation. We've seen a lot of talking on the antitrust sphere, cooperation between competitors, state aid, it's really leading the way. On merger control, according to Director General Olivier Gerson, the rules are fit for purpose. So there's no need to adjust the merger control rules in order to look at more wider objectives like environmental benefits and, helping achieve the carbon-free neutral Europe by 2050. But in reality, the only reference that was made, it was about killer acquisition. I think a concept very similar to what you have seen in the tech space. Are you going to buy out that competitor of yours because they have a manufacturing process or something which is more greener? and but at the same time kind of affects the way that you traditionally produce. So what I would say, we still have to see a case. We have Kai Uwe here, but I really do wonder. I mean, we talk about efficiencies throughout. We are a bit it's a bit hard, let me put it that way, to go through with efficiencies on a merger case. I mean, efficiencies on environmental grounds, that's going to be quite of a steep trial. But someone should try, and let's see how it goes. And let's see what the internal document will say about these green objectives as being the objective for the deal. That's what I can say.
Thank you. Anna?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Anna Maria said. I think the other interesting, perhaps political overlay on this, I find interesting in the green agenda with merger control and competition policy more generally, is I think this is another area where we see that interplay between the Commission and the member states, where I think a number of member states, particularly the Netherlands and Greece, kind of got ahead of the Commission and said, following the zeitgeist that actually sustainability and the Green New Deal, the green agenda is really important. The Commission felt a bit out of date, old-fashioned in its thinking, and so I think has been forced into considering this. So I'm really interested to see where the Commission comes to, because certainly some of its constituents, insofar as we're thinking about the national competition agencies, would see a much bigger role for competition policy in terms of driving a sustainability agenda. So that I think will be an interesting thing to watch.
Yeah, I think that companies, we need to do a little bit of what you might call back to the future. People will remember that we used to have a notification procedure for collaborations or commercial agreements generally, and obviously that was abandoned under Regulation 1. But I think that where companies, have genuine green collaborations that are, that I said they're genuine, they're not a sham but something else, then I believe that they should be thinking about going and talking to DG Comp early, explaining their views. Anne Maria, being fulsome in their description of efficiencies, and that is a way, I think, to test whether or not what we're hearing from the Commission in terms of its desire to assist, whether we will see that. And there are definitely ways under 1013 to achieve those objectives, and to my mind that's been a little used, and of course there are others. So I think that we should be encouraging our commercial colleagues to think about engaging early with the Commission, looking for solutions. So we are just now on time, which is remarkable. I wanted to thank each one of you, Anna Maria, Anna, Nicholas, and Kai Uwe, for being with us today. I found the conversation really stimulating and interesting. We could probably spend quite a lot longer debating these issues and others, but I thought we made a good fist of a challenging discussion. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.